Thanks, Greta, for joining. Really excited for your talk. And so Greta is a senior PhD student in the Brain and Cognitive Science Department at MIT, and her work is at the intersection of AI, neuroscience, and cognitive science. Part of her work is concerned with understanding how language and audition is processed in the human brain compared to how it's processed in the artificial neural networks. So yeah, please.
Good. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm very excited to share some of my work. And I know that many of you work on computational models within various domains, and hopefully this talk can provide a bit of a different perspective as to how you can use computational models. In particular, I've been very interested in using computational models to study how humans process sounds and language. So that's what this talk is going to focus on. So yeah, let's get started. And first, let me provide a bit of high-level motivation for what I'm going to talk about. So right now, as you're listening to the sentence I'm saying, hopefully, you're going from the sounds of the words, basically just pressure waves in the air, to the meaning that I'm trying to convey to you. So I was saying, as you're listening to me right now, you're going from the sounds to the meaning that I'm trying to convey to you. And if you start thinking about it, it's quite remarkable. It's basically transmission of information from my mind to yours. And this is all due to the code, a code that we share, the language that we know how to map from the sounds to their meanings. And this is a lot of what my work is about. Basically, how do we extract meaning from text and speech? And while we have one system that performs this process highly efficiently and robustly, and that is the human brain. And if the input comes in the form of audio, that being speech, then we have to engage a set of regions, the auditory regions that I'm here showing by the green demarcations on the surface inflated brain. And even though I'm just showing the left hemisphere, these regions are bilateral, meaning that they're on both sides. And they're in a part of the brain that we call the superior temporal gyrus. And these regions basically support auditory perception. So input has to flow through these regions to enable the conscious perception of sound. Critically, these regions are not language regions. They don't perform any linguistic computations, such as storing the knowledge of individual words or how they go together. There's another set of brain regions that perform that process, the linguistic process. And those regions I'm showing here by the red demarcations, also in the left hemisphere. And the red demarcations show the very typical regions that any given individual would use to process language. Most individuals have a left lateralized system, meaning stronger activations on the left, weaker activations on the right, even though this doesn't have to be that case. And these regions, as I just said, are the frontal and temporal areas, as I'm showing. And these regions are selectively and causally engaged in language processing, meaning that if you lose part of the system, you will end up with linguistic deficits. Also, these regions support what I'm calling here a higher level language processing, meaning that irrespective of whether the input flows through audio, speech, or whether you're reading text, then ultimately the input will end up in approximately similar regions. So these regions are in that sense independent of the modality in which the input comes from. And hence that's why I call them higher level, because they're not dealing with the perceptual aspect of either listening or reading. These regions together can perform the process of extracting meaning from speech. I'm not talking about reading right now, and I want to focus on this talk. And in addition to the human brain, then, as of a couple of years ago, we of course have artificial neural networks that for some audio and language tasks can actually perform on par with humans. Of course, not all, but I don't need to convince you how impressive they are. Here I'm just broadly considering them as artificial neural networks, ANNs, irrespective of whether they perform an audio or language-based task, because I'm going to focus on both things in this talk. And most critically, these ANNs are not trained to account or model directly after human brain data or human responses in any way. Rather, they are trained on the biologically relevant task various biologically relevant tasks, for instance, recognizing various sounds, recognizing words in speech, or predicting the next word. And these models being trained for these biologically relevant tasks provide us with a set of candidate models for us in neuroscience, like myself, because now we, for the first time, have models that can perform these tasks pretty well. And suddenly we have a system that we can try to test, do these processes happen in similar ways in the models and in the humans? And that's a lot what my work is about, which is trying to leverage these artificial neural networks to study the human brain. Of course, this doesn't have to be a one-way street. We could also go the other way around. On my PhD, I've mostly focused on the upper part here. In the end, I'll just provide a couple of perspectives on how we can leverage human brain insights to actually improve models. That brings me to the outline. And as I just mentioned, I mostly are focused on leveraging NS to study the human brain. First part of the talk will focus on computational models of auditory processing. And the second part of the talk is going to focus on computational models of language processing. And with that, let me guess. Oh, and then, as I said, I'll have a small perspective in the end. Yeah, and let me get started with the first part. First, some motivation and context. As I mentioned, in this part, I'm going to talk about, we want to use computational models to get a better understanding of the human auditory cortex that enables humans to hear. And of course, understanding can be defined and derived in various ways. But one measure of understanding stems from quantitatively accurate models that can predict how a given brain region or network will respond to any arbitrary stimulus. And this work falls in this domain. In this case, we're interested in a model that can take sensory signals, in this case, sounds, and predict how a given brain region, in this case, the auditory cortex, will respond to that arbitrary sound. And when we started this project, there had not been that much work in this domain, especially within audio. There was one larger study that had been performed, which was by Keller colleagues from 2018. And in that study, they trained a convolutional neural network jointly for recognizing a word and recognizing a musical genre. And after they optimized this network, they discovered that this network actually predicts human fMRI responses in the auditory cortex pretty well, better than a non-ANN baseline. In addition, they found that this neural network that they trained also had a correspondence with the auditory cortex. And by that, I mean that they found that earlier layers of this convolutional neural network better match primary auditory cortex, which is shown in the black outlines, and earlier layers are shown in the more pinkish colors, while later layers of the network are shown in blue colors and match these outer, more non-primary parts of the auditory cortex. So this was a really cool finding. You know, it shows that this model is like a pretty decent model of what is going on in the auditory cortex, possibly. But there were a couple of limitations. One of them being that they only use these two very particular tasks and a single architecture class, that being the convolutional network. And they had many architectural hyperparameters that they searched across to get the model that performed the best on the given tasks. And then they only tested the final model for the fMRI predictions. And finally, this model was trained on a cochleogram, a time frequency decomposition that mimics the processing in the human cochlea, hence providing a human-like front end to the network. So, yeah.
What does match mean in this model?
Match?
Predicts human fMRI response. What use the match?
Right. I'm actually gonna go in detail of the exact, what I mean exactly by match in just a second, but basically it's regression. So we take the units from the network and then you predict an fMRI iteration. It's coming in like one slide, 2 slides. So yeah. But yeah, definitely feel free to ask questions, especially if something's unclear or yeah, thanks. So as I said, this was an interesting finding, but there were potential limitations, especially on the generality of this finding. And that made us wonder, like, can you just take any given audio neural network and use it as a good model of the auditory cortex? Does that work? And that leads me to the main question that we did ask in this project, which was, does any artificial neural network for audio account for brain responses and exhibit hierarchical layer region correspondence? And that means that if the ultimate goal is to obtain this quantitatively accurate model of auditory processing in humans, then can you just train any given audio neural network for any given task, and then great, it matches well, it's solved. And well, the answer is in the title of the paper that was published in December, where we claim that many, but not all, deep neural network audio models capture brain responses and exhibit correspondences between model stages and brain regions. And this is co-led with Jill Feather and in collaboration with Dana Bobinger and Josh McDermott. So now moving on to just the approach to make clear what we actually did. First of all, we wanted to test different audio models. And at the time when we started this project, which was in 2021, we took every audio model that we could find at the time of the experiments with a public PyTorch implementation and not trained by any like super small scale task. We wanted to span multiple different architecture classes, and we also wanted to span multiple different training tasks, such as speech recognition, speech enhancement, audio captioning, audio source separation, and so on. And in this table, I'm not intending on going over this full table, but it's mostly just to show you here on the left, I'm showing each model name along with the color coding that I'm using. And also just to show, these models are pretty diverse. They are trained for various different tasks on various different training data sets. And this is, of course, a kitchen sink approach. It means like the benefit is that if you do find that all these models are good models of the auditory cortex, it has pretty good generality. This is a very diverse set. The downside, on the other hand, is that this is very uncontrolled. Like any difference you might find between these models could be attributed to, oh, they have different training data set, different input, different XYZ. So in that sense, it's a tough type of approach for making very controlled comparisons. To try to do something about it, we supplemented with a set of models that we trained in lab ourselves. And these were 10 models that had two different architecture types, one convolutional architecture, the other one resonant 50 architecture. And we had 4 different training tasks, them being recognizing a word in a given 2-second sound clip, the other one recognizing the speaker, recognizing an environmental sound, and the fourth one being recognizing a musical genre. And because of the nature of the data set that we used to train these models, which was curated by Janelle Feather, the word speaker noise data set, we could actually train one model on 3 of the same tasks simultaneously, calling a multitask network. And that is because the audio sounds that these models were trained on, the 3 ones, not the musical genre one, and the multitask was basically consisting of a different speaker uttering a different word under a background of an environmental sound noise. So in that sense, these models were trained on a tightly controlled same data set, just for different tasks or switching up the architecture. And finally, this also enabled us to manipulate whether a given model is trained for a task with or without the environmental sound background noise. And I'm gonna just talk about that finding in a couple of slides. Again, here just showing the color coding that I'm using. The convolutional architectures are in different shades of red, and the resonant architectures are in different shades of green. Cool. And now on to your question of what we mean by match, because that can mean different things. In this particular study, the human participants were in the fMRI scanner listening to 165 natural everyday sounds, while their brain activity was being recorded. And these were 2-second clips. And of course, the fMRI signal is very slow relative to the sounds. So hence we basically get 1 scalar value per sound per person for each little 3D pixel voxel in the brain. And we can then pass, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention these, the fMRI data was collected in 2 different prior studies, one from Norman Hagner in 2015, having 8 participants, and the other study from 21 by Dana Bobinger with 20 participants. And these were participants who listened to the same sounds, but completely independent participants, and pre-processing and various other aspects were different. Cool. So to compare between humans and models, we also have to pass the sound to the models. So we do that. You pass the sounds, obtain the embeddings from various stages in the model, and then we, in the results I'm presenting here, we then fit a rich regression from the embeddings to the scalar vector for each single 3D pixel voxel in the brain. And the measure of similarity that I'm showing here is then computing the Pearson correlation and then taking the R squared between the actually predicted voxel responses. And in addition, in the paper, we also used another metric, which is representation similarity analysis, not depending on regression, but still attempts to measure similarity between 2 systems. Findings were broadly replicated, but for brevity, I'm not going to report those findings. Cool, let's move on to what we found. The first question was, do these various different 19 audio ANNs outperform traditional models of the auditory cortex? And what I'm showing in these plots are on the y-axis, the median noise corrected R squared from this regression approach. And on the x-axis, I'll be showing different deep neural networks. And the gray line here shows our non-ANN baseline, which is a spectrotemporal filter model, which is ultimately a linear filter bank centered on different temporal and spectral frequencies. So here I'm showing the different 19 audio ANNs that we tested. And as you can see, many of them perform better than the non-ANN baseline, not all of them. Maybe one thing that sticks out is that the best performing model in light green here is a ResNet architecture that is trained for multiple tasks. And to replicate these findings, we had our other independent data set. So we ran the same analyses here on 20 participants. And we saw that these were highly correlated. So it seems that this measure is actually very, very robust just because we pool across many voxels, many participants. One thing that I forgot to mention here is that the way that we select the score for each single model is by taking the best layer selected on non-overlapping data to get this type of summary plot. So from the first question we found, which was title of the paper, that many audio ANNs, but not all, can account for the human auditory cortex voxel responses, and with the model that is being trained for multiple tasks being the best one. And maybe of interest to anyone, some of the in-house trained models that performed well was AST, Audio Spectrogram Transformer, and VGG-ish. Yeah. But of course, as I also preempted, it's pretty hard to make very controlled inferences from the external models. The next question that we asked was, does this similarity that we see here depend on task optimization? Meaning that do you need to train the model to learn this particular task to see this correspondence? Or is it, ANNs are hierarchical, they have like several stages. Maybe you can pass a sound input through this stage-wise process and you can still see good performance. So to investigate that, we took the models, we basically permuted, shuffled around all the learnable aspects of the model, the weights, biases, whatnot, and then we ran the exact same analyses. And here the y-axis is a bit shortened, but what we see here is that all models perform below the non-ANN baseline, and leading us to claim that optimization for a task is critical to obtain a high model-brain similarity, which is consistent with the idea that neural representations, whether those are artificial or biological, are ultimately shaped by the demands of the task that they're performing. And now I'll move on to the, do they then map onto the auditory cortex? Do they have this layer region correspondence that I started up introducing? To investigate that, we need to find the best predicting NN layer, and we need to measure how well each NN layer actually fits the fMRI data. So we obtain our predictions from every single layer or stage in the model. And on this plot, I'm showing again on the y-axis, it's just a sketch, prediction performance, the R-squared. The x-axis are now not models, but different layers within a given model. And for instance, a plot could look like this, pretty typical, early layers, maybe a little bit worse, and later on it gets better. Then we find the argmax, the best particular layer, and then to normalize across all these very different models that have different number of stages and so on, we then normalize such that the earliest layer is layer 0 and the latest layer is layer 1. And that's what I'll report in this comparison. So this plot is a big summary plot. So here we took the 15 models that performed better than the non-NN baseline. And then we take the median across participants, and we get this relative best layer position value for each single voxel, little part of the brain. And more greenish colors are earlier layers, and more red are later layers. And the two different brains show the responses from the two different data sets. The black outline here showing the primary auditory cortex. So even though this is a highly average and smooth summary representation, you can see there is definitely a trend in that more primary areas of the auditory cortex actually seem to match, have higher prediction from earlier layers, while non-primary auditory cortex outside of the blackish outline are better predicted by later stages of these networks. And again, we took the permuted models to see whether this is due to task optimization. Do you need to learn for a task? And we saw that, as you can see, the permuted models don't really show any interesting structure here. And of course, these are qualitative maps. We also performed a pretty rigorous quantitative investigation during statistics. And it does pan out that the task optimization is critical to get this hierarchical layer region correspondence. And as I just said, this was a very highly average summary plot. So we can also look at every single individual model. We have the multitask model on top, audio spectrogram transformer, VGG-ish, the ResNet trained on audio set. And again, as you can see, we have this general trend of the primary auditory cortex being better predicted by earlier stages in the model, which we did not see in the permuted models here on the right. And I mean, this is kind of interesting. It basically shows you that the primary and non-primary human auditory cortex might instantiate distinct types of representations that resemble earlier and later stages of a computational hierarchy that also we use to perform various engineering tasks. Onto the last little part of this section, which is how does a model's training data modulate the model brain similarity? And as I said, we had this set of models that we trained ourselves so we could perform highly controlled comparisons. And here I'm just showing one of them that was of particular interest to us, which concerned noise or background sounds. And this is interesting for at least two reasons. One is that humans are incredibly robust to various kinds of noise. And secondarily, many models in engineering, maybe some of you know much better than I do, sometimes have a separate denoising system, and then a model is trained like post hoc on some other task, which might be a good engineering solution, but is most likely not how the brain is solving that problem. So hence we're interested in investigating how do models that are trained on a speech task in background noise perform relative to a model that's just trained in silence on clean speech, basically. And the two tasks that we looked at here were the models that were trained to recognize a given speaker or to recognize the word in a given clip. So these are two speech-based tasks. And then we just either add or remove the background noise sounds. Here for the two data sets, the bars, the hashed bars are the ones that are clean speech, and the different colors show the different architectures for the recognizing words and recognizing speakers. And as you can see, training in background noise makes a big difference, such that models that are trained to recognize speech or perform a speech-based task in background noise were more brain-like, potentially because hearing a noise imposes constraints on biological auditory representations. And we also looked at some training task comparisons, but I'll refer to the paper for that. Any questions for this section, or I will, yeah.
Maybe I have
Yeah.
one question. Did you look at all about whether the different models, what kind of representation they take as input and how that, you know, spectrogram versus waveform, for example, or different types of spectrogram, right? Perceptual bands.
Yeah. Yes, good question. For the external models, I believe 7 out of 9 of them were based on a spectrogram input, while 2 of them were on the raw waveform. And the raw waveform was the wave to back, and then one other wave to back wasn't one of the better ones. I mean, yeah, you can't really tell from this like pretty short comparisons. It seems like spectrogram is, I can't really say, you know, the two with the waveform is a little bit of a rough comparison. That said, our in-house models were trained on the cochliogram, which is spectrogram. So, and those were the best performing ones pretty robustly. So I think that leads us to think that a type of spectrogram would be the right way to go. Yeah, thanks.
So
Yeah.
what could you say on a high level scientific descriptive level of what the auditory cortex is doing? And the two candidates are it's computing intermediate representations that enable reconstruction of the input, that maximizing the information content that's preserved. And the other one is that maximizes the probability of correct distinctions, classifications, in which case it's important to actually throw away nuisance information. Which, where are we?
I would say it depends on where in the auditory cortex you are. I think in more primary regions, it would be more in reconstruction. You don't want to lose a lot of information there because everything has to flow through it. In the paper, we looked at various auditory components, these hypothesized neural populations that perform a particular kind of tuning property, whether they're selective for speech or for more frequency-based things or music. And in those more specialized non-primary populations, then suddenly it becomes more about what is the task at hand and how can I represent this as compressed and efficiently as possible. So I think there's a switch. That would be my hunch.
What is the voxel size in the neuron?
This is a 2 millimeter proportion, I'm pretty sure.
So it's 50,000 neurons.
It's even more. Yeah, it's a lot.
Is there a reason to believe that the population coding would be so local that they're all pretty much carrying the same information?
I mean, we see that they don't have the exact same tuning properties. So of course there is different types of processing, but you're right that, you know, it's a huge number of neurons. And in some studies that do intracranial work on auditory cortex, you can look at more fine-grained properties such as certain sites that are selective to the speaker or certain sites that are selective to the intonation that is being said. And of course, we just don't have the resolution at all to answer those kinds of questions here. That's awesome. Good. I'll move on to the language-based part. Of course, happy to take questions in the end as well. Oh, I had a small summary. Let that go. Well, yep. Onto language, which is what most of my work is focused on. First of all, I need to convince you that large language models, LLMs, and the human language system actually show some kind of similarity in their representations. And to test that, we published a paper in 21 where we had 43 different language models. It was like right after, not right after, but relatively shortly after the emergence of the GPTs and the BERT models, and there was a lot of excitement about them. And thanks to Hugging Face, partly we could just take a lot of them and just see like how well do these language models actually perform against similar, both fMRI and actually also intracranial recordings from humans processing language. And in this particular plot, we use data where this is fMRI data, but also works pretty well for intracranial, where participants are processing just single sentences between 5 and 20 words long. And then you do the same as I just explained in the other section, where you try to predict how well a given model can account for the responses. And we see that, many models perform pretty well. The gray line in this case is quote unquote a ceiling. It's not really a ceiling. It's basically if you take one human brain and then you try to predict another human brain, then what kind of value do you get? So this is in some ways an inter-participant reliability threshold of the data. And what we see here is that many models perform pretty well again, with the GPT family in blues here being the winners. The poor models here on the left, the grayish ones, are all word embedding models, for instance, Glove. So those that don't take any contextual information into account when processing a sentence. So this is something that we consistently see, that having a model that integrates context well is pretty critical to obtain good predictions of language regions in the brain. Yeah.
So, so I would interpret this as that there is almost no predictability, or isn't 0.1, isn't the total maximum 1.0?
This is a non-normalized plot. Yeah, thanks for asking. So this is a raw Pearson R value that I'm showing on the y-axis. So this is relative to the inter-participant ceiling that I'm showing it. But you're completely right that if you take the R squared of this, these are very low. So language is harder. Language is, yeah, I started working with language models first, and then I moved a little bit into audio, and then I kind of like moved back. And when I moved to audio, I was like, wow, perception is nice. Perception is nice because perception is more reliable. Humans have such different linguistic experience, and it's further removed from the perceptual aspect of the stimulus. So it is definitely harder to predict language regions. Yeah, thanks. And I guess that's maybe why I put somewhat in this box, which is that large language model humans conversion somewhat similar representation of linguistic stimuli, because it is approximate. It's definitely, it kind of works, so it's not super high performing. So language is not solid.
I'm sorry, so what is the human behavior that's being measured here? Is this fMRI activations again, or?
Yeah, this is fMRI activations again, aggregating across the voxels in the red blobs that are shown in the beginning, so the language selective areas. And meanwhile, you asked, so the way that we actually define the language regions is by dependent localizers. So we have a task where if you were a participant, then you would be either listening or reading well-formed sentences, and then there would be another control condition, which would be either a language that you don't know, or degraded speech, or a list of non-words, and then you contrast these two responses, and then you can find the regions in the brain that we denote as language regions, meaning that they care about what the individual words mean, but also how you can combine them into sentence level meanings. But that plot was mostly just to show you, should I claim that, actually, yeah, the basis of what I'm going to talk about now, which is this paper that we published a couple of weeks ago on kind of trying to leverage the fact that these LLMs are actually predictive of brain responses. So as I mentioned, the reason why I showed that plot was to say that large language models have some extent of predictivity of brain responses during language processing. And claiming that in itself is pretty cool, but you need to think hard of how to interpret it and how to make inferences from it. So I was interested in kind of leveraging it more in an experimental way to learn more about the human brain. And the main question of this project was, well, can we leverage the predictive power of these LLMs to identify new stimuli, that being sentences, that can maximally drive or suppress brain responses in the language network of new individuals? So by that, I mean that we want to identify some kind of sentences that will make these many neurons respond as highly as possible in the language network. Or, for instance, my skin feels like melting wax. Or can we find some sentences that will try to elicit as minimal response as possible in these regions? In that way, kind of leveraging the predictivity of these LLMs as a tool to investigate what is going on in the brain, which we don't know that much about, some, but not. And this main question, I think, can be separated into two sub-questions. One of them is, well, are these LLMs actually accurate enough to non-invasively control brain responses implicated in higher-level cognition? And why might this be tricky? Well, fMRI is noisy. As we just talked about, humans have very diverse linguistic experience. And as we also just maybe touched upon, is that the language system, these red regions, is dealing with more abstract, high-level meaning representation and is not very closely tied to the perceptual aspect of the stimulus. It's not like a visual region or the primary auditory cortex where there's not as many transformations to basically go to the place in the brain where you are. So we wanted to ask, does this work? It's like more like an engineering question. And the more scientific question was then, well, what kinds of linguistic input is the language system most responsive to? And the reason that's interesting is you can compare it to work that was done in actually late 50s and 60s by, for instance, Hugel and Wiesel, who discovered that certain orientations of these like light slits would activate a neuron the most. So if you have a given light that is at a given angle or rotation, then you will see that certain neural populations here, this is from the cat visual cortex, would activate really strongly. So in a sense, this is what we're after, just for language and for humans. Basically asking what is the optimal stimulus, what is the stimulus that will make the language network respond as highly or as minimally as possible. So yeah, moving on to how we built this predictive model. We again used fMRI. We came up with a set of 1,000 very diverse linguistic sentences. They were all 6 words long. We had 5 participants in the fMRI scan read all these 1,000 sentences, thanks to them. And then we averaged across the activations for every single sentence across all participants, across all 5 participants. And then we basically get a vector of the average language system response for every single of these 1,000 sentences. And the reason that we average across people is that I was interested in building a model that is a general model of the general language network and not, oh, I could build a model of Samir's brain or my own brain. But part of the motivation for this project was also to see what is general about language processing. Can we generalize these kinds of models across people and not just build a model that is particular to one kind of person's language system? And here, to fit the model, took my favorite GPT-2 XL model, passed the sentences through there, and then similarly fit a rich regression model to then predict the activation to all of these 1,000 sentences. And this model is now pretty convenient because it can take as input any sentence. GPT has nice tokenization. There's no limits on what you can pass in there. And then it can output the predicted language system response. And now I'll just briefly show you a cross-validated model performance on these 5 participants from 1,000 sentences each. And x-axis shows the cross-validated model prediction, and y-axis is the normalized brain response. And you could always say, like, is the glass half empty or half full? There's a positive correlation here. Let's see if it's good enough to fit a model that you can use to drive or suppress responses in new participants. So as I mentioned, what we're interested in is to fit this model and then ask what kinds of sentences can we use to get responses to go as high or as low as possible. Yep, that's just what I said. And the way that we found those sentences, we had two approaches, but this was our main approach, was a little bit brute force here, is that you take a bunch of sentences that you can find, either from the internet, like transcribed spoken sentences, fiction, and then this was almost 2 million different 6-word sentences. We take GPT, we get the GPT embeddings, and then we use our fitted model that I just showed you to then enable to provide a prediction for every single of these 2 million sentences. And because we're interested in the highest and the lowest predicted ones, we just sort this vector basically. And then for the condition where we aim to drive to maximally activate the brain responses, we take the top part, the top sentences that we found. And on the other side, we take the lowest predicting ones. And then the goal here was to then take these new sentences and record brain responses to these new sentences in new participants, because as I said, we're interested in generalizing, extrapolating to a new person. And here are some examples of the sentences that we found. For instance, some of the sentences predicted to drive the responses were people on Insta be like gross, or Turin loves me not nor will. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have sentences like we're sitting on the couch, or they walked out onto the balcony. So of course you might have various intuitions of, yeah, please go ahead.
Just to clarify, the brain responses, you stick somebody in the fMRI, you read a sentence to them, and at what point do you take an image? After?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly right there. The fMRI scanner, every sentence is 6 words long, so it's pretty short. And they're reading, so they get the sentence presented on the screen, one sentence at a time for 2 seconds. And that is a sampling rate of the fMRI scanner. So it means that we get an image for that given during that reading.
Yeah, so my intuition was going to be sentences of high complexity would go one way and the cliche ones would go the other. But how does this, I mean, you have, when you take your average over your fMRI calculations, that is a statistical model of data. Right?
Yes.
So you're using one statistical model of the data to predict another statistical model of the data, but not necessarily the workings of the brain.
I guess I mean, it's right that fMRI in general, not this this project in particular, is dependent on fitting the generalized linear model of the fMRI responses. That is correct. That is a statistical model that we use to estimate the responses. And then with all this work, yes, then we are taking a rich regression model using the computational and whatnot, and then fitting another model on top of that. So it is completely correct to say that yes, we are not directly fitting a model of the inner workings of the brain. I don't know if you think that intracranial recordings would be that, you know, there you're not fitting another statistical model to get the responses, but maybe you have other algorithms to find out what are spikes, what are like, what's noise. So I guess it becomes a gray zone at that point. So yeah, I don't disagree. And I have something about perplexity in a couple of slides. And then on to the question, did this work? And here we collected brain responses in new participants that then read all these newly identified sentences. And in one experimental design, we scanned 3 participants. And here we show the normalized brain response on the y-axis and the condition average responses for the drive sentences in red and the suppressed in blue. And the gray ones are the initial 1,000 set that they also read, just as a baseline, pretty much. And as we could see, this definitely worked. So that was cool. That was great. Just to make sure that this wasn't a particular work of the experimental paradigm, you know, people were reading a lot of sentences, and this was somewhat a new paradigm that I kind of came up with and no one had really used before. So then I ran it in another more traditional fMRI experiment. And we saw again that the drive did indeed elicit high responses and suppress elicited lower responses. So this shows that we successfully could modulate these brain responses in the language network in this closed loop manner, meaning that we use the model to come up with the sentences. And now on to one of the main questions that we were interested in this project was, what is the optimal stimulus of the language network? What kinds of sentences? What is special about them? Why do they make the brain regions fire? And one example that I will cover here is based on how the human language network processes sentence structure. And on the spot, I'm showing on the x-axis a grammaticality rating for every single sentence in our big study. And these sentence ratings were provided from MTurk raters, more than 2,000 participants in total across several features. And they're basically asked, for instance, for this rating, given this particular sentence, how grammatical is it? How much does the sentence adhere to the rules of the English grammar? And then on the y-axis, I'm showing the brain responses across all participants. And on the part that's circled here, we have the easy to process sentences that are highly grammatical. You know, she wore a short black dress, or they stopped in front of us. These are highly grammatical, very easy to process, and we see that they elicit somewhat low responses. And what I'm showing above in the inset-like figure is just the responses average in these rating bins, basically. And then if we go to the middle of the grammaticality scale here, we see that sentences like, I'm progressive and you fall right, it made me so baby hungry, are the ones that actually would elicit the highest responses. So it seems that we also investigate surprisal perplexity, which is also a strong, also has a strong correlation with the brain response. So we see that these sentences that are surprising, that have some kind of a weird grammar and or meaning, those things are often very correlated in natural language, have the highest responses. And here on the other end of the scale, interestingly, if the input becomes completely ill-formed, so I don't even think I'm going to attempt to read some of these, but if the input becomes almost like a word list or something that you can't even extract meaning from, the responses will kind of like level off and be lower again. And yeah, we investigated other sentence properties, which are in the paper. But this led us to the conclusion that these surprising sentences elicit the high responses, but sentences that are very, very easy to process or do not adhere to the natural statistics of the English language, in this case, elicit low responses. And if you think about it, it's pretty fascinating that we have certain parts of the brain that is so sensitive to the meaning of the input, right? It's like, if it's very easy, like I don't need to engage the regions that much. If there's something interesting, there's a lot of information to be extracted, we need to respond highly. If the input just completely does not fit the statistics of what I want to see or hear, then the responses become low again. And a final comment here is that I think this project would not have been possible without large language models. There are many things that could be done without large language models, but this particular project, you need a model that is predictive enough. Of course, the better prediction the given LM has, the better, the higher accuracy we could obtain. But I could not have come up with a sentence like, I'm progressive and you fall right. My experiment for mind is too biased. I can't come up with this kind of stuff myself. So this shows that leveraging predictive models based on LMs can be pretty useful for this more assumption neutral types of approaches that then you can follow up and do more controlled experiments with. Yeah.
So presumably your yellow word lists they don't get emitted by any LLM. Your love pancakes.
That they don't.
The LLM doesn't emit any of your random word lists.
To provide embeddings, you mean?
Sorry?
Provide embeddings for them, or?
Oh, I see. You're actually generating the sentence.
Yeah.
You're just asking for the embedding.
Yeah, just getting the embeddings.
So did you also have the LLM provide embeddings for these random?
Yep. All of them, yeah. Yeah, because of the BP tokenization of GPT, then it ultimately just gets down to characters, so we can get an embedding for every single sentence. So that was the nice part of using a non vocabulary fixed model in that sense.
Okay, so then the entire curve, the upper curve, is in fact the correlation between L embedding for all three cases. And
It's not, this plot in particular has, I wouldn't say, has nothing-ish to do with the LLM, besides that they were selected based on the LLM. So in this plot, the LLM was just a tool to come up with these sentences, and then afterwards we can try to analyze them and understand them. I do have a plot of correlations of the predicted response from the rich regression model and the real brain response. I'm happy to show up and supplement. But otherwise, it's very similar to the kind of stuff that I show here, which shows the model prediction based on the LLM and then the actual brain response. So in this order. Okay, maybe through here. Yeah, this is just summarizing. And does anyone have any additional questions to the language model part? Yeah, thanks.
I have a question regarding the subjects of the experiments. Were there mostly native English speakers? How do you think this would scale bilingual or multilingual speakers?
That's a good question. So actually the only criterion that we had for inclusion in this study was that they were native-ish English speakers. And what I mean by that is that they speak English by approximately age of 7, 8 years old. And actually, in a study that I ran in December on a subset of these 1,000 sentences, I just had a hard time finding, people that adhere to this criterion. So I ended up scanning 4 highly bilinguals. That some of them learned English in their late teens, and a couple 2 native English speakers. And of course, I only had a subset of these sentences. This was a shorter study. But the overall trends were the same across bilinguals and then also the native English speakers. Yeah, but bilingualism is super interesting, and that was kind of a factor that we didn't want to add in this study because there's so much that was new and experimental that I was like, okay, let's just not deal with those unknowns in this particular aspect.
I think it's interesting that the model that performed best for you in correlation is the only autoregressive model in your so next word prediction seems to be the right task, I guess. So,
Yeah. No, I mean there's been various studies investigating comparing also causal, the next word prediction models, and then the bidirectional. And most of these studies find that the causal ones are better, which is cool. There's a couple of studies that find the reverse pattern, which I guess I don't know how we should interpret that.
But no one has done this controlled like GBD5 or sorry, GBD 3.5 is probably trained on much larger data and like So I think could be so we cannot really say like the task or is it the data?
There's one study that did actually a control comparison where they trained their own models. It's Tuckute and King, Current Biology 2022, where they did train both unidirectional and bidirectional LLMs on the same data. Everything was like completely controlled, and there they did find that the causal ones were better. So I think that's probably the cleanest thing that I can think of. Great. Just a couple of notes on things that I'm interested in, or how you could use the human brain to potentially improve artificial neural networks. And all of this is kind of a new, very much work in progress things. One is that I know that also some people here are working on it, but I think it's a really cool question is, how can we develop models that learn meaningful acoustic units? It's fascinating because humans, of course, learn language through continuous speech, and we figure out pretty much without explicit supervision what is a good unit to deal with when you process language. And we only learn to read later on. And all these LLMs that we use in these studies, they all learn from pre-tokenized text. And ultimately, if you want a good model of the human language selective areas in the brain, it doesn't seem completely right to do it this way. So I'm definitely interested in getting a well-performing model that actually learns without supervision from just the speech signal. And there's been a couple of studies where we've been trying to discover these acoustic units in a self-supervised way. So that being the masked autoencoder approach, where, for instance, given a spectrogram, we aim to identify the key points of the spectrogram, the points that are most informative, that is, of a given reconstruction, and then trying to isolate the units that kind of stick together and trying to see if we can leverage that for broad, like ultimately this model should be able to work on both speech, but also all other kinds of audio signals. That's what humans can do, right? This model should not be dependent on one particular kind of input signal. So that's one interesting thing where definitely there's a lot to learn from humans and somewhat the human brain, maybe more behavior actually. And the second aspect that I've been involved in is, can we develop language models with spatial topography? And a hallmark of the human brain is that, it's organized in functional modules to various extents. Some of them are small, some of them are larger mass that can be tile the brain. But the brain has wiring costs, and hence it has some kind of organization spatially. And most models, there's been some work in Envision that aim to create these topographical models, but most models have absolutely no spatial priors. And in this particular project, we induce spatial priors in the transformer key query attention operation. So instead of in standard attention operation where a key is just associated with one query, then what we did here is that we take a key, and then instead of just associating one query, we create this like pool across such that a given key is associated with a larger, you could say, like receptive field of queries. And what we find is that if we train a standard BERT model with this like spatial querying, as we call it, here on the left, and here I'm showing the keys stage of the transformer, which is kind of reshaped into like a 2D matrix. And the values here show the negative signed log p value in a comparison between 38 sentences that are animate, or about animate content, and 38 sentences that are about inanimate content, and then comparing a t-test between those and looking at what is the negative signed log p value. So it provides a metric for the selectivity in which direction it is. And as you can see, things that are about somewhat the same semantic content, in this case, animate and inanimate, lands in these like fields that are close to each other. And well, we don't see that in just a standard BERT if we do the exact same thing. And in terms of performance, what we have found so far is that this BERT model with spatial querying performs on par or slightly worse with the standard BERT model in terms of NLP tasks. So we tested blue, the performance there is on par, slightly worse. So it means that it is possible to train these models that have this potentially interpretable topography. That's a hard problem itself to interpret what is going on here, but maybe you can win in interpretability of this model and not lose too much in performance. That's what we find so far. I think that is all. Yeah, thanks so much for the questions and for listening.
Do you think you'd get as good predictions if all of your fMRI subjects were illiterate?
And if they were listening?
If they were fluent speakers, but never learned.
Oh, that would be a cool experiment. But you mean that they would be exposed to sentences through visual medium?
In the fMRI, you read the sentence?
Yeah, they read.
Them, or
they were reading themselves. in the second study from they were reading themselves. So sensors was just presented on the screen one at a time, and then they were reading. So of course that is not maybe that interesting, but in actually the study that I ran in December, I just had the sentence auditorily presented, which, as I said, the network is approximately the same. I mean, so the question you're asking is, how do representations change based on learning to map the sounds onto their textual counterparts? And they do, I would assume. Not sure how. I don't think anyone has a good answer to that in more high-level processing. There are studies that look at the visual word form area, so the area of the brain that takes care of, it's like this character word area that is highly selective to letters. And that area is very, very experience dependent, meaning that if you read Hebrew or Chinese or some other language, then you'll have high responses to the languages you've learned to read. So if we assume that those principles move on to higher level regions such as language, then yes, then they're highly shaped by your experience of learning to read and what particular language it is, of course. But I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because ultimately most humans learn language through just speech, and scanning kids is very, very tricky. But the shift that then happens when you learn to read, which of course later on, like kids are a little bit easier to scan then, what is that transformation? How do these representations reorganize, change, become efficient? You know, do you chunk them in? Like, you know, that's a gold mine of good questions there, I think.
And another question, there are other ways of embedding sentences, like real old ones, like semantic analysis,
Let's say.
right? Which in this case be non-causal, although you can also causal, and also there are embeddings from kernelization sequences, right? Presumably these all are preserving. So is the claim that there's something special about LLMs, or any statistical model that's information preserving would be correlated with fMRI activations?
I think any statistical model that takes context into account would be correlated with fMRI recordings. So if these other methods are decontextualized and provide fixed vector representation for every single word, irrespective of context, I would assume that they would be pretty poor based on what I've seen on other like older word embedding models. For someone to later want to mention, I don't really know them, but do they take context? Do they aggregate across?
It's just, you can train.
Yeah. In that case, in that case, I think they would be pretty good, as long as, I think there's one more thing that has emerged, both from language, also from vision, somewhat audition, is that I think that matters a lot for obtaining high predictivity of these, both fMRI and MEG intracranial recordings, is that the model needs to be trained on diverse input. This is kind of in line with the background finding that I mentioned, and this has also been shown in like very, very robustly in vision, that like the training diet is what matters the most. So I think if you could train one of those older statistical models on a big diverse corpus and make the claim that this actually works, I mean, that sounds like a pretty good project to me. Then, you know, transformers are not magical at all. We don't need them. They just came to be that they're trained on a lot of data, and they perform the task well. Yeah, no, that's a pleasure.
Well, I wonder, like, I don't think, like, in an essay or glove, for example, you still have a fixed embedding. You don't have a different embedding based on the context, like, LLM, for example.
But I guess you could train the glove objective on full sentences if you had just a huge corpus, and then create a sentence distinctiveness space. I mean, let's say that you would train a transformer and the glove objective on sentences on the exact same data set, then you could at least get whether it's the training data set or it's a particular task, or yeah, what drives the performance. Yeah, I'm definitely interested, like, as I think I alluded to, claiming that an LLM is predictive of the brain just in itself is not informative of much meaningfulness, but making those kind of comparisons actually provides like some distillation of this. If you have probability A but not probability B, then you have good predictivity and so on. Is super interesting. And we need more neural data because that's also a big bottleneck in our field.
So I have a question about your last slide. You were talking about acoustic units. Is the goal, like, obviously acoustic unit discovery, there are a bunch of methods, but is your goal ultimately would be to train a LLM directly from speech, basically?
That would be the best case scenario. And I mean, train an LLM directly, sure, but I think like even viewing the acoustic units, if that's a separate thing and it just creates a good enough intermediary stage, that's not crazy at all, right? No, that's could hypothesize be the auditory and speech regions, of course, it's like a good stage. I think both are actually not bad. Yeah, I'm curious to hear like what your thoughts are on the state of the art of the textless NLP and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why I mentioned, because there are already LLMs that exist trained on like these codes, extracted from speech.
And I guess there are many ways of, making those models better and or developmentally plausible in terms of the data and like the way that, they do the prediction on top. And I think that's a very cool space. So I keep up with the literature. It's interesting. Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to see like the LLM, the type of knowledge it's learning versus the LLM trained on acoustic units, for example. Like what is the difference?
Yeah, I saw people have started creating these benchmarks for the speech elements, right? That's the benchmark from text or something being turned into speech, and that's great because that actually allows us to make those comparisons. So